So what's really changed is public perception. In recent years, we've seen numerous high-profile instances of data breaches, such as the Equifax hack last year, 2 years ago, which exposed hundreds of thousands of social security numbers, home addresses, as well as things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal in the 2016 election, where data was harvested illicitly from Facebook accounts. So now that the consumers are really asking for regulation, states are taking it upon themselves, recognizing that there's no federal law, they're going to have to implement something. And these companies recognize that now 30 states have introduced their own legislation, and that's going to be very hard to comply with. So they're trying to get an overarching federal bill, so basically they just have to comply with one law, and especially one that they have an input in shaping.
So Mark Zuckerberg's op-ed in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago now, you think that that was in response to, in some ways, to these local state laws,
Yeah.
and he wants something broader that's easier for Facebook to operate on?
Absolutely. I mean, the loudest voices have been from Facebook, Twitter, and Google. All of them, all executives have testified before Congress saying, please regulate us, give us something, let's work together. We're here to help write the bill even. So Mark Zuckerberg's op-ed in the Washington Post that he basically asked for a nationwide bill. He said the worst thing that can happen is if we have state-by-state legislation where it's kind of a mishmash of laws. And that could really fracture the internet in theory.
What would that look like? What would a fractured internet look like from a consumer standpoint, a user's perspective?
I mean, it's possible and it's concerning, and that's actually something that no one wants. Consumers, companies, governments. If you remember last year, the GDPR, which is the European Union's data privacy legislation, it went into effect, and that's the strictest regulatory body for data privacy in the world. When that went into effect, there were certain US websites that were actually taken offline in Europe, and big sites too, like the LA Times, the New York Daily News. They were taken offline for a period of time until they could comply with the new regulation. And so while people were cheering that new set of privacy standards, they also were realizing that it can stop the free flow of information between the United States and Europe, and that can be a shame. And so people really want to avoid that domestically, especially along state lines.
Is there any indication that federal lawmakers will make some sort of, nationwide legislation here in the next year?
Yeah, I mean, from the companies and the experts I've spoke to on my reporting on this, they say if there was ever a time, it's now. Again, with Congress, you have to always wait and see. There's always partisanship and political dysfunction that gets in the way. If you look at the California law, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is the most robust of any state, that was passed unanimously by the California state legislature. So it's pretty, it's almost unheard of that to happen in the Congress. But we'll see. Numerous bills have already been introduced. Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts just a couple weeks ago introduced the Data Privacy Act, Bill of Rights Act, which would kind of codify it at a national scale. Senator Marco Rubio also introduced another bill. His was more about protecting data privacy but not stifling innovation, in the House as well. So I guess we're going to have to kind of wait and see how those coalesce. But as I said, if it's ever going to happen, it'll be this year or next.
Is it clear at all about the type of material impact this could have on some of these businesses that rely on the internet, all of the users, continuing to come back to their platforms, the data that they're currently able to exchange, and then ultimately create an offering that people just want to engage with?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, like I said, kind of the public sentiment had changed in the last couple of years. People were no longer willing to exchange their data for a service or a platform that they can use for entertainment or whatnot. So these new laws would basically, one, make it more transparent on what they're collecting and if they're sharing it or selling it, who it goes to. There's also rules that would make it mandate that if a consumer asked for their information to be deleted, then a company has to do that. But a few lawmakers, especially in the House, have taken things even a step further and are trying to mandate something called like an opt-in option, which is used quite often in Europe. Where consumers actually have to check a box like, yes, you can use my data. And that's something that actually really concerns companies because it kind of takes things a step farther. And most people, when they're presented with the option, just won't check the box. They'll just continue to use the service.
I mean, what are the challenges that we know of that a company like Facebook has faced already because of now, I think you said 20 different states getting on board and inking their own sort of regulations? I mean, for years, we heard how that was challenging for ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft, right? Having to move at each of these different communities' regulations. But this is kind of the first time we're hearing it for a massive behemoth like Facebook.
Yeah, no, it's tricky. It's tricky. And Facebook actually has an advantage because they're already kind of compliant with the GDPR in Europe, and that's kind of known as the gold standard, and that's what California's law was based off of. And several other states have looked at that as kind of a roadmap. But it's tricky. I mean, but I think what Facebook realizes is that the worst thing that can happen is they get a hit on their reputation. When people stop trusting them, then that's what really affects. So it also affects their bottom line if the consumers don't trust them. And so they're kind of asking for the state to step in and kind of provide a baseline for them to comply with.
Regulation is not something that happens fast. When you think about the period that we're in right now, going into a 2020 election next year, and some of the candidates very vocal about how they would like to break up big tech, how they would like to regulate big tech even more so. Do you think that that just throws some lighter fluid on this fire where they're looking to regulate tech, and tech could get hit even harder after the election in this case?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think what these companies recognize is their voices will be more heard in Congress. Whereas, like I said, in California, they voted immediately to implement this. From who I spoke to, there was kind of a bit of a backlash. They felt like it was rushed, and they felt like industry wasn't really asked their opinion on this. Whereas GDPR in Europe was kind of over a span of 5 years. California did it in like a year and a half. So they feel like by going through Congress and somewhat circumventing the states, they'll be able to do it in a more measured way. And privacy advocates might say, well, then the bill will be somewhat diluted, but at least there'll be a uniform code.
Yeah.
Even within the tech world, are there winners and losers? I mean, does presumably the biggest companies always win because they've got the most resources behind them?
Yeah.
Even if you look at, Google versus Facebook versus Twitter, are there certain companies that are more clear winners than others?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. Like those big companies, those behemoth companies, they have tons of money, they have tons of resources. Even if they do get a fine, sometimes they can just pay it and move on, whereas smaller companies don't have the resources to make those changes. But there's also a flip side to that. These smaller companies don't have so much data. They can easily change their systems, where these big companies that are just buried in data and changing one little system is really tricky. So it really kind of depends.